looking forward to asking you all the hard questions about physician mental health. For those of you who are new, I'm Janae Sharp. I'm the founder of the Sharp Index, and I met Wendy Dean several years ago. And I want to talk about your perspective, because I hear a lot of perspectives about mental health. And then if you have anything to share, or if we can really break it down to give people something new.
Yeah.
That's what the goal is today.
Right.
So tell me, how did you come to be known as the person who does things with moral injury and physicians?
So it's a great story. I mean, it's not a great story, but it's because it didn't come out of a good place. But I was working for the U.S. Army as a civilian, doing research funding oversight, and just down the hall from where my office was the office that was working in neuropsych health, which included their suicide prevention program, because that was the time when the DoD had the crisis of deaths by suicide in veterans and active duty. And so they had $100 million to study the problem, to look at ways to prevent it. Their leadership was alarmed. We shut down the Army for an entire day. 3 million people stopped working to figure out, to learn what were the symptoms that you could pick up in your colleagues and what were your resources. If you saw that, what did you do? The entire Army shut down. And I started looking at the clinicians that I was interacting with across the country, who had these research funding projects that they were doing. And they were not happy. These folks on paper were at the tops of their games. They were at prestigious universities. They had CVs a mile long. They had hundreds of publications. And they were struggling. And I started asking them, are you burned out? And almost to a one, it got to the point where it was kind of uncanny, where the wording was almost the same from everyone. I don't know, that just doesn't sit right with me, because I knew what I was signing up for. I knew I was going to work long hours. I knew I was going to see impossibly hard things. What I didn't know was how hard it was going to be for me to get my patients the care they needed. And I started talking to Simon Talbot in particular, and he and I are co-founders and co-partners in this work. And we realized that he's a plastic surgeon, I'm a psychiatrist. And so, we couldn't be more different in the spectrum of the healthcare, the kind of healthcare we provided. And yet we had the same experience in healthcare. And we realized as we shared our own stories, this isn't about us. This isn't that I'm not resilient enough. This isn't that I am not efficient, that I can't figure out how to do better workarounds. I'm doing all of that. It's that there are barriers I can't get past because of how healthcare is structured.
What are those?
I mean, there's a
2
laundry
minutes.
list.
What are they?
There's a laundry list. It's regulation, it's legislation, it's policies in the hospitals, it's checkboxes for reimbursement, it's all of those things. It's prior authorization. So all of those things get in the way of getting my patient what I know they need.
Right.
What I know is available, but I can't get to it.
I do have a question about that, because I get to talk to a lot of people, and people say things to me that maybe they shouldn't. You're a polarizing figure. And even the topic, like a lot of people are like, she said it, I didn't know how to put it into words. And then other people are like, I don't know about that. It's like a little too much. Why do you think it's so polarized?
So I think some people think they hear me say, it's not burnout. Like, burnout doesn't exist, it's all moral injury. And I absolutely do not believe that. So I think there is burnout, but that doesn't cover the entire spectrum of distress that people feel. That is the sort of resource mismatch. I have too many administrative tasks. I have too too much in my inbox. I have too many calls to make. I'm working too many hours because we're short-staffed.
Right.
But then there's this other piece, which is the relational disruption of healthcare, where, moral injury, the definition is, there are two that are in wide use. One is betrayal by a legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation. So when someone says to you, this is how I expect you to provide care, when you know that it's not, that isn't what your training dictates, because it's better for the organization or it's better for them, that's where we get into the challenge of moral injury.
Right.
So I don't think we should stop doing the things that we're doing to try to address the administrative tasks, the overwork, those kinds of things. But we also need to make sure that we are addressing the relational issues in moral injury.
So I have an uncle who is a veteran from Vietnam. When I started hearing about moral injury and PTSD, it was in the framework of his experiences in Vietnam, right? And he had some stories that are horrific, like his leaders doing horrible things. He's like, you could feel it. So, and when we've talked before, it's been with people who are also like experts in PTSD. And as you know, working with Veterans Affairs, like there are some really horrible stories. What is it about healthcare that's different than that? And what is it that's similar?
So the moral injury that we see in the military tends to be more often single egregious events. In healthcare, I think it's more like the death by 1,000 cuts, where it's just every day I go into work and I know that I'm not going to be able to get my patients the care they need. That is exhausting, right? So that's one of the differences. I also think that in the military, and this kind of means that we need to go back and think about what is our covenant with society as a profession. Mm-hmm. In the military, it's to protect. And unfortunately, part of that protection sometimes requires that you go to lengths of lethal force. So there is inherent in that commitment to joining that profession that you may eventually have to do something morally injurious, right? In healthcare, that isn't our covenant. Our covenant is to heal. And so I sort of think that if the flag of moral injury goes up, that's a signal that we should be looking at our systems and saying, what's happening here? Because this should not be an event in healthcare.
Why do you think, when you say that to people, like in healthcare, who gives the most pushback?
I think people push back the most when they when they're not really clear on what it means. Because we've done research with a group in the UK that shows that even executives experience moral injury. Throughout the pandemic, about 40% of executives were experiencing moral injury. And what I've heard repeatedly is people will say, oh, I didn't really understand until you put it into their framework. So, the one definition, betrayal by a legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation. And there's another that is perpetrating, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs. And we believe that they're not two separate definitions, that they're linked. That you experience a betrayal, and then you have a moment when you can choose. And it's not, and I want to be clear, it's not always a voluntary choice. Sometimes it's a forced choice, where you can either stand up, speak out, push back, and say this is not okay, or you can acquiesce to that betrayal and transgress your own moral beliefs and expectations.
I like that it's not always a choice.
It is not. I mean, there are plenty of us who are primary earners, who have huge student debt, who can't practice a specialty anywhere but where you're practicing.
Right.
You don't have a choice to leave. But it doesn't mean that you aren't in that moment aware that you could either speak up, but for these constraints, and instead you have to acquiesce.
Right. I had a friend once who said that to me in the context of like having kids, since, you know, the other parent passed away. They're like, do you really have the luxury of morals right now?
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, okay, first of all, that was pretty harsh.
Yeah.
They're a math guy, right? And I was just like, okay, rude, first of all. And second of all, good point. Have you ever told someone that? Like, what do you tell physicians?
I mean, I don't think that you can tell someone that. I think you can empathize with their being.
Is she still on? Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I feel like it's always important to empathize with people's position, where they are. And I can't dictate my morals are not theirs. My position is not theirs. So what I
That's
feel
a very
like
healthy answer, right? You can tell. She's like, I'm a psychiatrist. Your feelings matter.
I feel like what is important is to help people understand what their options are, and to help them understand what's possible now, what's possible in the future.
What are the options, like, for a physician? That I could give you a story. Like,
Yeah,
I have a friend who called me a few weeks ago, and she was having trouble. She had, she was pregnant. She lost the baby. She almost died. She's a physician. She's having difficulty with the going back to work because she had to take leave for depression. And the weight of all of it was so heavy, but also what do you tell people on that individual level? Like, what are the possibilities that people, do you think they see them or don't see them? Like, or, you know?
So first, I think that's a slightly different situation.
It's a slightly
that's not moral
different
injury.
situation.
That's
It's like literally the worst.
That's legitimately grieving.
Right.
Right. That is a terrible place to be in.
I'm glad we did, though, because now I want to talk about the difference between grieving and moral injury, because so many people now have lost a colleague or, have lost something.
Well, so I think one of the things that we really want to make sure that we do is to stick with the definitions of moral injury. So betrayal by a legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation that cause you to transgress your deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. Right. So those are the setting conditions for moral injury. So if you come into a room, I've heard this story, when someone came into the room, a vegan, and a colleague was eating tuna fish, that person said, that's a moral injury. And I just want to be clear that those kind of situations aren't necessarily, right? It may offend you, but it's not a moral injury.
Right.
Right. So I just want to make sure that we keep those definitions very clear so that we don't have creep.
That's hard too, because
it is very
I feel like
it's hard.
Like, because the language is the same, a lot of the times the difference between like grief or like workforce issues versus moral injury, to me, it's a continuum of horrible, and on the continuum of horrible, like, it's important to be able to have those definitions, but I'm not always clear on where they are. And I'm also not always clear on which solution works. And I feel like you might have more insight about that, both from your background and experience.
Yeah, so I think the thing to keep in mind with moral injury is that betrayal is really important. But it's also that point where you're asked to betray your oath, right? I am being asked to practice in a way that I didn't expect that I would be. That does not align with my commitment to my profession, to my training as a physician. And that betrayal is a relational rupture. And so if you think about it that way, what we need to do in order to repair moral injury is to do relational repair and rebuild trust with our workforce, to rebuild trust between the workforce and the administration, to rebuild trust between patients and clinicians.
Have you seen that happen successfully?
It is hard. It is hard to find places that are doing it well.
All right.
It is hard. It's easier to find places that are doing it well in bits and pieces. But globally, it's very hard to find places that are doing it well. And I will say, there's a funny story. We went into an organization that we thought was doing it well. And we went in with a specific intent of getting their story so that we could use it as an example. And we walked into the room with the CEO and the president, and they said, "Oh, we are so glad you're here. We've got a problem." I thought, okay, well, we're going to pivot then.
How was it? Did it go well? The pivot?
It did. Yeah, and that's, so what we notice are when leadership is open to feedback, particularly from their workforce, the transformation, the repair tends to go better. It is sometimes very hard to remain open to that feedback because when people have been through what they've been through in the last 3 years, the emotions are pretty intense.
Yeah. It's hard to be open to feedback when you're already drowning.
Right.
I want to ask you where you think your place is in healthcare. Like, what do you see as your, like...
It's a small question.
It's a small
It's
question.
a very small question.
So she won an award last night. And we asked hundreds of people in healthcare who are involved in mental health. And some of the other people in the same category, which is like healthy healthcare, they were like Surgeon General, giant position, or like a health system that was doing quite well. And you won. And she didn't just like win a little bit. It was like these people are kind of tied down here. And Wendy Dean is like winning by far. Why? I mean, maybe this is an opportunity for you to brag, because I think it was important, especially since some of the judges were like, oh, this giant organization is naturally going to be the person who wins. And you see that a lot in healthcare, where people trust authority a lot. And I was like, you guys don't realize that like the people involved in mental health, they're not going to have the same voting rules that you have in healthcare. Has that been something that surprised you? Or like, does it surprise you that you have such a powerful voice? Like, why did you win?
Because it's not about me.
Right.
That's the secret of our organization. It's not about me. It's not about Simon. It's about giving voice to clinicians who feel voiceless. And that's what I hear most of the time is, I can't say these things, but you can. And it's why we are an independent organization. It's why I have not affiliated with anyone, because I don't want to have that voice silenced. And I want to be able to get the emails from clinicians who say, here's what's happening in my organization. I can anonymize it and I can put it forward and I can collate it and aggregate it and say, here's what we're hearing on the front lines.
Do you think, what's something that has happened that's been the most gratifying for you then? Like, how do you measure your success?
I don't spend a lot of time thinking about my success.
I like that.
I don't, because that's not what the work is about. The work is, what I feel like is success is people are thinking about it. They're looking for ways to change. And clinicians who are struggling and suffering feel like they're being heard finally.
Right.
So, I guess the fact that the language is out there in healthcare now feels really important. But every time somebody says, at least once a week, I will get a call or an email and somebody says, oh, I found this and it feels, finally, I've been looking for this exact language to explain my experience for the last 3 decades. And my response every single time, and it surprised me, 6 years later, 5 years later, when somebody says that to me, my immediate response is, I'm so grateful that you have that language, and I am simultaneously heartbroken that you need it.
Yeah.
And so my real success will be when I work myself out of a job.
Right.
like that will be success for me.
That is a great measure of success when you're like done with the work.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about, you're writing a book, right? Didn't you just write a book?
I wrote a book. It's about to come out. I'm about to hold it in my hand, the publisher says next week. Yes.
So tell us about it. And then we're going to have questions. If everyone can think of one hard question, that'd be great. That'd be great. She's like, we can ask hard questions. I'm like, okay. I'm going to ask the audience to help. Okay. So tell us about your book while everyone thinks about their hard question.
So I never, writing a book was so not on my bucket list. And it was one of those where this is also a great story. We were having dinner with, Simon and I were having dinner with Sam Shem, who wrote The House of God. And Sam was like, oh, you guys need to write a book. And we were like, oh no. He's like, nah, it's not that hard. You really need to write a book. And so we thought about it for a while and realized, you know what, that's the best way to get the message out. We want it to not just be for clinicians, but also for patients, to understand, why is your experience of healthcare so hard? It's not that your clinicians don't want to do better. They do. They're dying to do better, almost literally. And so this is a book about, it's narrative nonfiction, because everybody learns better with stories. It's easier to read and digest stories, but it follows, there are stories of 10 clinicians, physicians in particular, who faced moral injury, why healthcare was in the situation that it was in. So it goes into the background of why they were in that particular situation, sometimes going back to 1900. And then it also talks about who's been successful getting out of it, who's faced it down. And the goal of it is to get physicians and patients speaking together and asking for change.
I like that. Like having people speak together.
Correct.
All right. You ready for questions?
Ready. I'm ready.
And then, yeah. I'm looking. Does anyone have a question? Oh, look. There's a question. I'm like, summarize all your work.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank you for your work.
Oh,
Hello?
all right.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for your work, because I myself, as a physician who started off in general surgery, did not have that language to understand, because it wasn't about the hours. I had a pretty horrific story in which we had a patient who was sexually assaulted and needed surgical care. And at the time, I needed to go to the emergency room. That is the only place where they had sexually sane nurses, which sounds to me insane. Like, you have to go to someone and say, I need to find someone sane to evaluate you for sexual assault. But she needed to go to the OR. And if we went to the OR, then she wouldn't have been able to make the claim. And so that's the kind of dilemma that you're in. I can't send her back to the emergency room. She can't make the claim. I need to get her to the OR. So that's only one of like many, many stories. And I'm sure like a lot of people have that. But I think that residency is a key time when people are faced with this impossible goal, right? You have, as you were speaking, I was thinking about the fact that residency is the first time that a lot of doctors are given this impossible workload. They have little voice and the stakes are so high against them. And they're forced into this kind of hero complex. And I think in the pandemic, we see that a lot, as well as because a lot of the attendings were not coming in. They were afraid of COVID. The residents were frontline. The residents were getting sick, and their careers, their future, their ability to practice medicine is at stake. So what is the role? So I'm getting to my question. Sorry. What is the role of your work in addressing the residency training? And should residents be unionized? Should they be protected? Should they have maybe even hazard pay in regards to moral injury or anything like that?
So I'm not going to pretend to say that hazard pay is going to be a solution. What I do think is that we all need to be better at helping residents, learners of all kinds, everyone on our team have a voice. And I think we don't do a great job right now of teaching residents how to speak back, how to speak up in a way that others can hear and that is safe for them. We also need to make sure that their attendings are willing to be protective, right? So if a resident speaks up, they are incredibly vulnerable.
Right.
And if they don't speak up, they're also vulnerable. So we need to put in place some better mechanisms for teaching attendings what their role is, what their influence is, and then helping residents understand how to have that voice. I mean, I spend a fair amount of time now talking people through that, who are attendings, who have been out for 10 years and are saying, what do I do with this situation?
Dr. Dean, so far, great conversation. I'm curious, as your book comes out, what your hopes are. What would be your top 3 hopes as far as a demonstration of clinicians and patients coming together and actually changing something?
So we're planning an event in a town out in the Midwest in June that is a community-wide conversation, including law enforcement, the National Guard, healthcare, and the community, to say, how do we think differently about what we want in this community? And I think that's it. That's what I want. I want everyone in the healthcare community to be speaking together about how we want it to be different. That includes patients, clinicians, administrators. This isn't a problem we can solve by ourselves. And it's not going to get better with individual solutions. It's going to get better as a community. And so, in particular, I would love to walk into a meeting one day where there are patients, clinicians, and administrators, and I can't tell the difference between them. Because they each are equally empowered, and they each feel equally safe to speak up, and each of them is being listened to equally.
So I have a follow-up question for that.
Mm-hmm.
Some people say, like, you know, they're doing this well-being program. They want us to tell them how we're doing. But why would I tell my employer that? Like, why a conversation?
I'm not sure I follow it.
Why do you say the conversation is the goal? I feel like you might be defining conversation as differently than how a lot of people take it.
So I'm not defining this as we're going to have a conversation about my mental health.
Right.
I think that is necessary and insufficient, and that is not going to change the situation with moral injury. We absolutely need to make sure that it's available for clinicians, but that will not change the dysfunction of our systems.
Right.
So that is the conversation that I'm talking about having.
The conversation about the system.
Correct. How
And
do we
then-
want this system to be different so that it's easier for all of us and it's more healing for everyone?
And then they actually do it.
Well, yeah, they have to follow through.
Yeah.
That's ideal. Yeah.
I feel like it's ideal. It's ideal.
Well, what a lot of organizations don't realize is when you have those conversations, people get their hopes up. They invest a lot of energy and effort into giving you the information you need to make the change. And if you don't follow through, that in itself can feel like a betrayal.
That's a great point. Like in terms of building trust, like if you just ask people how they're doing and they're like, horrible. And then you're like, good to know, bye. Like that can be pretty demoralizing.
Or if you ask, how do you think things should change? And then you don't follow through and say, okay, here's how we're planning to make that change. Or here's why we can't. Right now, we will keep this on the burner for 6 months or a year from now.
Well, thank you.
Thank you
For your work, and thank you for coming and for sharing that. Like, I appreciate it, and I'm glad you're in this space.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Yes, thank you both.